Hello, welcome to another English language A-level video with me, Paul, from the QE here in Darlington. And this one is some feedback about the English language AQA Paper 1 Meanings and Representations questions. 2017. There's the question. Analyse how text A and then text B uses language to create meanings and representations. Notice that the focus here is always on the language. Okay, so whatever you're writing about, don't get drawn into writing about the images or the font sizes or the column spaces, etc. This is not media studies or film studies. This is language that you're focusing in on. And also this word meanings is pluralized. There's a little S inflection on the end. So different people will infer different things from the texts in front of you, depending upon who the audience is and in what time scale. And that's particularly important if you're looking at an older text where the values and the attitudes of the reader, let's say in 1900, may be completely different to the 21st century reader like you or I. So it's meanings that's important. And also remember this word representations. Remember, a representation is a version of reality, which is not necessarily the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And therefore, text producers are trying to position you, the reader, in order to make you think and feel in a certain way through the versions of reality that they produce, i.e. the representations. Okay, so the paper that our students have been looking at is this one. This is the June 2017 paper. This is Metro News, but not as we know it. So this is an online newspaper. You will see it most of the time in train stations, but this is the online version of it. And as you can see here from the slogan here, the marketing device there shows that they're trying to be a little bit different. So they're selling themselves as a newspaper that's a little bit different from mainstream newspapers. And by way of a recommendation, you've got this stat here of 68.3 million shares. So this is your classic blended mode text. Sure, it's written down, but it's going to contain all sorts of conversational features to make the reader feel that they are interactively taking a part in the news themselves. So have a look at the headline there. We've got Veronica Campbell-Brown runs in wrong lane at Beijing World Championships, doesn't get disqualified. The first thing you might notice is that this is news, but not as you know it, because you've got a great big long headline there. Now, usually newspaper headlines are highly elliptical noun phrases, something like fury over Campbell-Brown lane change might be. But this is a long sentence. So therefore it's different from what you'd expect to see. But it is elliptical because we've got two clauses here and we've got the ellipsis of a contrastive connective like but, which you would usually have before doesn't get disqualified there. So it's putting focus on a particular athlete that the reader might or might not have heard of. And then we go into the story itself. Veronica Campbell-Brown is 33 years old, has won 16 Olympic and world champion medals, and has probably run more races in her career than she could possibly count. Now, this is news, but not as we know it, because it's not adhering to the normal expectation of what you'd find on a newspaper first sentence, i.e., what has happened, to who, when, and where. Instead, this sort of starts more like a magazine article, where we're setting the scene, we're being introduced to a character. We're given all of these stats, these determiners like 33 years old, 16 Olympic and world champion medals. So the stats there are showing us that this person is really an unprecedented champion in their field. Okay. Notice, by the way, the use of the so-called tabloid paragraphs here, i.e. one-sentence paragraphs. This is something that tabloid newspapers do. They're aware that the circumstances in which people are reading their newspaper may not be conducive to them, great big long sentences and great big long paragraphs. So they are chunking down the information so that cognitively it's less daunting for the reader to be understanding. So that's why the second sentence there, but despite all that experience, she has still managed to run in the wrong lane. And straight away, we're noticing here the use of some graphological features. I said at the start, don't go mad on commenting about graphology, but certainly you could draw attention to the capitalization in there, which is trying to bring sensation and drama to this particular story. And also, you've got similarly that in the caption, where you've got, excuse me, that's my lane. So again, blended mode text, although this is written down, there are speech features in here, and there is a supposed quotation. Presumably, this is not a real quotation from the athlete, and the focus in terms of the capitalization is on the first person singular possessive pronoun. So it's interesting that because you've got some negative politeness strategies where you've got the polite excuse me, but presumably we infer from this, and the other athletes should infer from this, that actually there's been a gross breach of the etiquette. Okay, so there are sort of pragmatic messages that come through in that caption. We go on. During her 200-metre heat at the 2015 Beijing World Championships, the Jamaican broke accepted sprinting etiquette by running about half the race in the lane next to her, which was also occupied by Briton Margaret Adair. Okay, so what's interesting here is that this Metro newspaper is primarily designed for a British readership, and therefore this is why it thinks this is news, that something wrong has been done to the British sprinter and that it's a non-British sprinter who has actually done this. Okay, so you've got a contrast, you've got juxtaposition of the two different nationalities which pre-modify the actual proper nouns of their names. Campbell-Brown went on to win the race and will get the chance to run against the IAAF competition rules state that an athlete will not be disqualified for stepping out of their lane as long as they do not gain an advantage in doing so or impede another athlete. So what you've got here is a contrast with the first headline, because in the headline, the casual reader would be forgiven for thinking that Veronica Campbell-Brown has committed some heinous crime, that she's clearly in the wrong and therefore she should be disqualified. But actually, when we get to the finer print down there in the fourth paragraph, we see that the rules state that she actually shouldn't be disqualified. Notice the use of the deontic modal auxiliary verb, will not be disqualified, which gives a high sense of certainty. Okay, so it's sort of conventional clickbait that we've got here with the headline, that it's stirring up our feelings and sensationalizing the story. And yet when we actually look at the precise detail later on in the article, we see that it's not as straightforward as maybe the headline led us to believe. So it's a really interesting headline. It does go on, but we won't take it any further. And instead, we will move on to text B. Now, text B is your older text. So here we go. The fourth Olympiad being the official report. The Olympic Games of 1908, celebrated in London under the patronage of His Most Gracious Majesty, King Edward VII. This is full of noun phrases, and that's obvious because this is a title page. It's a title page for an official report. Now, make sure that when you're writing about these texts, you fully understand the context of the text. This is an official report. It's not a newspaper article, and therefore it's got quite a limited readership. The implied readership is somebody with strong schematic knowledge of the Olympic Games and maybe have an official position. Okay, so the expectation is that it's going to be quite a formalized piece of writing. Notice also the reference to the king here, His Most Gracious Majesty, King Edward VII. So you've got the piling up of that adjectival phrase, His Most Gracious Majesty, which shows that this is a report that can only have been written in the height of the British Empire, when there was a lot of people who were deferential towards the royal family. And so we've got the full honorific title here with the noun majesty and the adjective gracious, and then the adverb most, and then the third person possessive pronoun his. So the piling up of all of those phrases really shows that we are here in a deferential society where people look up to and respect the royalty. And this is how you might use your knowledge of how an implied audience might differ in their response to an actual audience, because the implied audience of the time in 1908 could well have responded in a very deferential way, whereas we sitting here in the 21st century may have more of a kind of negotiated position towards the power of the royal family. And so it goes on. I mean, the other thing that we notice as our eyes draw down this page is the use of the passive voice. Now, remember, the passive voice depersonalizes and formalizes a text. And that's what we've got here, drawn up by and issued under the authority of. So the passive voice formalizes the message, and it also puts the focus on the Olympic Games itself, rather than the people who are drawing up the report for the Olympic Games. Okay, so that's given you a bit of a kind of overview of some of the opening linguistic patterns that are going on there. Now, at the risk of boring you, I just want to direct you again to the assessment criteria here. And you're basically getting 2 marks for your response to this. You're getting a mark out of 10 for your AO1, and you're going to get a mark out of 15 for your AO3. Now, on your AO1, I want to just draw attention to things in the top area here, patterns. So the students who are getting the highest grades are not just spotting individual features, but they're noticing patterns that are going across the text. E.g., oh, look, there's a lot of second person pronouns here in which the audience is being directly addressed. So you'd have that as your paragraph, and that would be your pattern. And then you'd sort of delve into how and why those second person pronouns had been used in different places in the text. So don't just go for individual features, go for patterns, and also try and show that your text is quite complex in that way, because whilst there may be patterns, there may also be anomalies, i.e. things that stand out from the patterns. So try and show that the text is not just clear cut and black and white, but there may be complexities that come through it. The other thing in the top level is that you need to be hitting different levels. Okay, different language levels. Now, if you're getting marks lower down, then it may well be that you're getting stuck in a lexical rut and that you're only writing about lexis and semantics. Whereas if you're up in this level, you're going to be including pragmatics and grammar and lexis and semantics, and possibly a little bit of graphology as well. So it's about different levels. And the other thing that you need to be doing at this level is guiding the reader, taking the reader by the hand and saying, hey, come on, I'm giving you a topic sentence here. This is what this whole paragraph is about. It's all about deontic modal auxiliary verbs. Here is how the pattern of how they're being used across this text. So guiding the reader means that you need to spend a little bit of time before you start writing, thinking, right, in my 3 or 4 paragraphs, what's going to be the central theme on each, and what are going to be my topic sentences. I mentioned about the AO3, that gets the higher mark, because the AO3 is all about your meanings and representations. So what the board are very keen that you do is you don't just feature spot, but that you talk about like the most significant features, and you link it into representations, i.e. what I said before, representations are versions of reality, which may not be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The other thing I want to draw attention to here is the wider social and cultural contexts. This is particularly important for your older texts, because they're a little window onto a past world, these older texts. They may be 100 years old, they may be 150 years old, and therefore this little text might tell you quite a lot about the sort of attitudes and values that people were expected to have in those particular times. So if you can link the representations to the wider social and cultural context going on in society at the time, then you are likely to be getting a very high mark. Okay, so this is the process of how you're doing this. Firstly, in terms of representations, you need to be thinking what 3 or 4 things are being represented in this text: things, ideas, or people. So, what or who is being represented? And then for each one, you need to be thinking, well, how is language being used to represent this thing? And then you need to be answering the question, why? So, why has language been used? So, we're going what, how, and why. And if you can do that in each paragraph following that process, then that's a good way of tackling this question. As I said before, you need to be drawing upon a range of different language levels. And you also need to be showing off because you are an A-level student and therefore you should have a very strong technical knowledge about how language works. So I mentioned before about second-person pronouns and deontic modal auxiliary verbs. Those are the sorts of things which will differentiate you as a real A-level student rather than just a chancing GCSE student who's managed to stumble across this paper. What you don't need is generalized opening paragraphs because these are 100-meter dashes that you're doing. They're only half an hour each question that you've got. So you don't want generalized opening paragraphs in which you ponder about the audience and the genre and the purpose. Dive straight into that swimming pool. Don't even take your clothes off. Just dive straight into there. As I said before, it's patterns that you're after. And lastly, you've got to be a quick thinker and a quick writer, i.e. you've got to move briskly between your points. Basically, you don't want to be writing less than 2 sides per half hour. Let's now talk about 4 particular ways that you can improve your Section A responses on here. We'll start with this word represent and representation. Get into the habit of using this word all the way through paragraphs. Here's an example. The text represents the Jamaican sprinter in many different ways. The determiners, 33 years old and 16 Olympics, help represent Campbell Brown as highly experienced and skilled, thereby contrasting bizarrely with her error of running in the wrong lane. So you notice how the topic sentence has the verb represents. So this is guiding the reader through the text. And then we've identified a specific language feature. In this case, it's determiners, 33 and 16. And we're linking it to the idea of representation, i.e. there's an odd contrast between the supposed skill and experience of Campbell Brown and her error in running in the wrong lane. The adverbs, probably and possibly, and notice how I never say the words, I always identify the word class. So the adverbs, probably and possibly, hedge the hyperbolic representation of the athlete as having run countless races using subjective language to qualify the emotive statements. So it's quite interesting that, isn't it? Probably and possibly. You don't usually see that in newspapers. So it's sort of toning down some of the more exaggerated claims that you might have inferred from the opening headline. The proper noun Jamaican and Britain Margaret Adair represent the runner's nationality as important elements of the narrative, encouraging the implied reader perhaps to feel that the Britain has been unfairly impeded. So you've got a paragraph of how many sentences? 4 sentences, and the word represent or representation has been used 4 times in there. Okay, so note what the examiner said about this. Some responses were overly concerned with the technical aspects of the data to the detriment of comment on the narrative and representations. Here's a second point in which you can improve your pieces of writing. So use linguistic terms in virtually every sentence. Here's an example. The high level of linguistic formality represents, and this is talking about the text B, by the way, rather than text A. So the high level of linguistic formality represents the report findings as serious and influential. So we've got a topic sentence which is guiding the reader, and here it's saying there's a high level of formality. So now we're going to have some supporting evidence to develop that point. The elliptical passive voice phrase issued under the authority of indicates that the report is an official document drawn up by a prestigious body and therefore demonstrating both influential and instrumental power. Those are two really good words to use. Instrumental power means the power of authorities to make you do things like the police and the law, whereas influential power is more the power of persuasion. The abstract noun authority represents the text as hierarchically dominant, with reference to royalty on the opening page to further enhance the prestige of the document. The full honorific title of the king, with the superlative pre-modifying adjectival phrase most gracious, represents the importance of hierarchical authority in the early 20th century and might possibly appeal to the patriotic respect for the royal family in these days of the British Empire. Now, what's happening there is that you're drawing attention to the wider social and historical context. You're thinking, this is written in 1908. People tend to be deferential in those days. The royal family have more of a high profile and more in the sense of instrumental power. Okay, so there you go. You notice that all those things there in blue are what you describe as linguistic terms, and therefore these are the things that are going to get double ticked by your poor old marker. Right, here's another tip. Focus on implied meanings. Of all the levels, then pragmatics is, possibly the most interesting level to be applying. And this is what I mean by implied meanings. So the headline's emotive version of events implies that the authorities should be blamed for not disqualifying Campbell Brown. By juxtaposing the verbal phrases runs in the wrong lane and doesn't get disqualified, the reader is likely to infer that rules have been unfairly broken. This implication from the headline and the first three paragraphs is, however, then undercut by the article's admission that this crossing of the lanes is only a breach of etiquette and that sprinters should only be disqualified if they gain an advantage in doing so or impede another athlete, which has not happened here. So a casual reader who only reads the first half of the article, or indeed the beginning of the article, is likely to make a false inference based on the hyperbolic language used with its implied pejorative representation of Campbell Brown, such as the capitalization of the final phrase, run in the wrong lane. Now you see the bits in blue there where you've got implies, which is something that the text producer does, and infers, which is something that the text receiver does. And if you can put the focus on those pragmatic features, then it's likely that you're scaling the heights in terms of the linguistic levels. The other thing I wanted to say to you just quickly is that do make sure that you respond to the whole of the data and not just the opening part. Now, I know that I've been guilty of that on this video, but only because otherwise we would have been sitting here for 3 hours doing this video. So make sure that the bits that you comment on are not just from the opening paragraph or so. For example, here we've got, this is from text B, it's the second half of text B, and it says, an athlete shall not be disqualified if he is pushed or forced by another person to step or run outside his lane or on or inside the cave or line marking the applicable border or This is very clearly written for a very specific audience, isn't it? This is not written for the general reader. This is written for a committee to pore over so that they can be satisfied that all of the rules have been followed properly. Notice again, we've got this strong use of the modal auxiliary verb, the deontic modal auxiliary verb. Brooks no comparison. It's very, very certain. It lays down the law. Notice also that in terms of pronoun usage, we have the male pronoun, which is used here to represent male achievement, because we're in 1908 and there weren't any females that were allowed to be competing in the Olympic Games at that time. So again, that's very much a product of a patriarchal society, a patriarchal world in which men have the ability to compete in these sorts of games and females haven't achieved that yet. Notice also the rather pernickety use of and repetitive use of things like the connectives, or so coordinating connectives and prepositions here, because it has to lay down specifically the rule so that in future everybody knows when somebody has actually broken this rule or not. So it's very much dependent on the schematic knowledge of the implied audience. Okay, so I hope that's given you a decent a bit of information there about how to approach this sort of meanings and representations, paper one. The last thing I'd say is that the more practice, the written practice that you do on these things, the better that you're going to get. And the need for speed is very, very important. Okay, thank you very much.